Paleolithic diet was about 40% omega-3, 60% omega-6. The Inuit diet, which is about 50% omega-3 and 6. The US diet are about 10% now. Ultra-processed foods have a balance of about 1%.
Tell us about the relationship between the declining omega balance and weight gain.
So there are three things. Development of fat cells. People that are obese have more fat cells. And when people lose weight, they don't lose fat cells. What happens is the fat cells shrink down. And so what you find is when people go off, they just go back to their normal weight.
So would a low omega balance diet in childhood, would that predispose somebody to obesity later too?
Actually, that's one of the most important things. Things that turn these stem cells into fat cells, these messengers come from the omega-6 in the membranes. So when they went looking for how cannabis works, they discovered the cannabinoid receptors. And of course, the receptors in our body weren't there for cannabis, they were there for what's called endocannabinoids. Too much omega-6 in the cell membranes, an increased production of endocannabinoids, and an increase in appetite, and also the conversion of carbohydrate to fat are all favoured by a low omega-3, high omega-6 diet.
What are omega-6 rich foods that we're eating, and what are the omega-3 rich foods that we're not as much eating? Welcome, everyone. We have an exciting show today, all about this hidden imbalance that can drive obesity and cravings, even insulin resistance and mental health issues. It's such an important topic, and we have Dr. Anthony Hulbert here with us, emeritus professor, zoologist, and author of one of my favorite books, a winner of the Best Book of the Year award in the diet and exercise category. It's called Omega Balance. So welcome to the show, Dr. Hulbert. This is going to be the first in a series because there's so much to unpack, so much useful information I think that you guys will benefit dramatically from. So welcome to the show.
Thanks, Autumn.
Yeah. And so as we dive in, I just want you to tell us, your book had this captivating story for me about a girl named Shauna Strobel. Can you tell us what happened to Shauna and what can we all learn from that?
Well, unfortunately, Shauna Strobel, when she was young, I forget how old she was, but she was about 8, I think, and she was being babysat and there was a gun accident. And apparently her intestines were damaged severely, and she had to be fed intravenously in a hospital. And after a while, after about a year, she started to develop symptoms that nobody really could explain, ones they hadn't seen before. All sorts of things like numbness, dizziness, and also her nervous impulses slowed down, going very slowly. Anyway, they were trying to figure it out, and one of the doctors said, oh, maybe it's the intravenous food that she's being given. In those days, there were only 2 intravenous feeds that had fat in them. It's very hard to mix fat and water together. And the one she was being given the fat came from safflower oil, which has only omega-6 in there. I'll explain omega-6 and omega-3 in a minute. And so one of the doctors said, let's change it to one that has soy. Now, soy is mainly omega-6 in the polyunsaturates, but it does have some omega-3. And when they did that, all these symptoms went away. So earlier, for a year, she'd been getting plenty of omega-6, but no omega-3. And when they started to replace her nutrition, she's getting intravenously, as I say, the symptoms went away. And that's the first really clinical evidence in humans that we have an essential requirement for omega-3, which is different and separate from the essential requirement for omega-6, which was known previously.
Yeah, and we are often lumping them together when we hear dietary recommendations for increasing polyunsaturated fatty acids as if they are the same. Tell us why that's a dangerous way to look at PUFAs.
Well, I don't like using the word polyunsaturates now. You have to. But on your food, they'll be listed as that there's 3 types of fat, saturated, monounsaturated, and polyunsaturated. In fact, there are 4 types of fat because it's saturated, monounsaturated, omega-6, polyunsaturated, and omega-3 polyunsaturates. Omega-3 and omega-6 are 2 very separate types of polyunsaturated fats. And they have different effects in their individual essential fats in your diet. You don't need to get saturated fat or monounsaturated fat in your diet because you can make them from non-fat sources, but you can't make omega-3 or omega-6. They have to come in your diet, and they come from plants originally in the food chain. And that isn't appreciated, that they're two separate essential fatty acids.
Yeah, and your book Omega Balance is why the balance of those two essential fatty acids is really important. And I want to get there and you'll define it. But you're a zoologist and you learned a lot about omega 3s from the animals that you studied. So, what were the really important takeaways about omega 3s in animals that you think
Well,
relates to human health?
well, I know it relates to human health. I started off just trying to understand what the metabolism of animals was about. Why did animals have to consume food, and what did they use that food for? And we found out that cell membranes, so around every cell there's a skin. And in fact, more importantly, I think people think of the human body like they think of machines that we make, like cars. But the human body is actually a community of cells, massive community of cells. And each cell can operate to some extent by itself. If you take it out and put it in tissue culture, it can grow. But and these cell membranes turned out to be very important. In animals, it turned out that we got into a comparison of mammals and reptiles, or mammals and lizards. And we found the mammal cells, rats it was, because we're working in the lab, were very leaky. And this leakiness and they maintained their internal contents by pumping sodium and potassium. And anyway, we found out the membrane was where all this energy was being used. And more importantly, it was the types of fats in the membranes and the types of polyunsaturated fats. And we found out that the animals that had a high metabolic rate had a high amount of omega-3 in their cell membranes. And that was how I got into this area.
Yeah, and did you also find out, clarify this for me, that those that had the higher omega 3s and the higher metabolism, do they have shorter lifespans?
Yeah, well, animals do have shorter lifespans. We humans are actually one of the longest living mammals. Uh, for our size, we should only live about 25 years. If we let a
Interesting.
sheep or a pig go out their full lifespan, they'd only live about that. Whereas the longest human lifespan is 122 years. So
Mm.
we're very unusual. And so that's been a lot of my research, metabolism and longevity. And we related this to the types of fats in the membranes of the cells.
Yes, so tell us, what is that omega balance, the concept, if you can? What
Yeah,
are the fats? Yeah.
especially in nutrition, a lot of people talk about ratios. I've been surprised. People will immediately go to ratios of omega-3 to omega-6. The problem with ratios is they're unusual in that ratios can vary from 0 to infinity. But the problem is that the halfway point between 0 and infinity is 1. you know, and so if you used a proportion, most of the time when we analyze things, we use proportions. We talk about percentages all the time. And so that's what the concept of omega balance is. It's saying that what percentage of the polyunsaturates are omega-3. So it would be if the omega-3 are half, well, it's 50-50. Or it's if the omega-3 are only 20%, it's 20-80. So you can still think of it as a ratio, but make sure that the two numbers add up to 100. And so that's the basic concept. Now, from what we can tell of the paleo diet, the balance was about 40%,
Mm,
roughly.
yeah.
In other words, 40% of the polyunsaturates we took in were omega-3 and 60% were omega-6. There's been studies done in the US back in 1910. That was the balance of the US diet. In 1960, it shrunk down to 18%. So omega-6 has increased and omega-3 has decreased.
Mm.
And in 1999, when they did a survey, it was 9%, and it's still less, well, even probably less than that today. That's the average for the whole country too, by the way. So there will be lots of people consuming very small amounts of omega-3 and massive amounts of omega-6. And
Okay.
that's the basic problem.
Yes, and tell us, where are the foods? What are omega-6 rich foods that we're eating, and what are the omega-3 rich foods that we're not as much eating?
Well, they come from plants. Most people don't realize that. And when they come from plants, we find that in general, omega-3 come from the leaves of plants. They seem to be very important for photosynthesis in plants. And omega-6 come from the seeds of plants. As soon as you say omega-3, most people immediately jump to fish oil. That's the that's the comment that's regularly made, omega-3 high in fish oil. In fact, it's not just fish, but all marine food is very high in omega-3. And that's because in the marine system, the plants tend to be leaves, algae, essentially. Marine plants don't grow seeds. But on the land, when in the agricultural revolution, we started growing various forms of grass for their seeds. We call them grain, but essentially a lot of food has become more and more dominated by seeds, and especially in the US nowadays, there's a lot of people concerned about seed oils. I call them vegetable oils, but they're the same thing. And and that's been a big problem because it's also that animals that have evolved to eat leaves are now being fed more and more seeds, grain, especially corn.
Yep, another big part of the problem. So what's happened? Is obesity, has it gone down as obesity rates have risen? Is there good evidence and are there parts of the world where it has gone down more? That tell us about the relationship between the declining omega balance and weight gain.
Well, it seems as if this obesity has become what's called an epidemic, which probably started about the 1960s. It's very hard to say exactly when it started. But now, especially in the developed world, obesity is a major problem, as most of us can see with our own eyes. But that's not in all the world. It's mainly, as I say, in the developed world. And in my opinion, it's been due to this very dramatic change in the omega balance of the foods, and also been connected with ultra processed foods. When we think about in the past, we used to get our foods largely from markets as produce and make our own meals. Nowadays, most of us get our food from supermarkets with shelves of brightly coloured packets, and this food is often made by complex machines, whereas in the past, as I say, we buy our food from markets. When I've been lucky enough to travel large parts of the world, and when you see markets in less developed countries, there's lots of green leaves as part of the market. You just know. Whereas you go into modern food sources, and there's relatively little green leaf. Even in the vegetable section, green leaf is not as common as it used to be.
No.
And to me, that's been the major problem that people just aren't aware of. Or
Yeah.
a
And
few people.
I read the book. I'm sorry. I read the book, The Queen of Fats, and that's where I learned about your work. And she says, when it comes to processed foods, they have to remove the omega-3s because they're highly vulnerable to oxidation. So you're
That's
right. It is that. And when I have vegetables, I always prioritize the leafy greens now because you're saying think photosynthesis rather than like green like a pea. You mean green like lettuce, like butter lettuce, like spinach, right?
Yeah, exactly,
Those are the
exactly.
richest sources. So
But
and there's been research to suggest that, like, when they look at people with a BMI over 30, for example, and they look at their omega balance in certain cells of the body, there is a relationship, correct?
correct. In fact, I was lucky enough. Although I'm a zoologist, I've become very interested in human nutrition over the last few years, and I got a Fulbright Fellow award to go to the US. And the opportunity came to get some tissues from people that were undergoing obesity surgery up in Boston. And I was able to get some muscle from the incision where they had the bariatric surgery, and I was able to get some blood and some fat. And we analysed it and found, that these people that had BMIs quite high, so hence they were undergoing the bariatric surgery or obesity surgery, were very low in omega-3s, but high in omega-6. And you need to continually think of them, think of them together. And that was in all their tissues, that they were deficient in omega-3 and too much omega-6.
Yeah, and there's this prevailing narrative, right, that animal research has definitively shown that high-fat diets create obesity. So what is wrong? What can you tell us about those rat studies and why the misconception exists?
Well, the misconception exists partly because uh, not enough attention has been paid by the researchers to the types of fat. The key thing, not the amount of fat, it's the types of fat. And almost all of these high fat diets that have been provided to rodents in these lab studies use vegetable oils uh, as the source of fat. So they're very deficient in omega-3s. When you use other oils, which have plenty of omega-3, you don't get the consequences of these high fat diets.
Yeah.
And so the rodents don't get obese, and they also don't become insulin resistant. So that's a key because many of these modern diseases are all linked. We call it comorbidity. It just means that people have more than one chronic condition, and I'd say it's because of this imbalance, which the general public really are relatively unaware of.
Yeah, I know that you had at least, I think you had two doctoral students kind of analyze, or maybe you did yourself, these rat diets that they're feeding, and the omega balances were like 7 or 4. And then your friend, Len Storlein, he did some research where I think there was like 6 different rat diets. Can you talk about that study and what it told us about insulin resistance? I thought it was fascinating.
So Len Storlein originally started off in psychology, and he was looking at appetite and obesity and insulin resistance. And he was doing what the standard high-fat rat diets were. He used safflower oil, the same type of oil that was used was given to Shauna Strobel. I'm not quite sure why safflower oil became so popular, but it had no omega-3. And at that time, people were becoming interested in the Inuits, and he read that diabetes, or the type 2 diabetes, insulin resistant, didn't occur in the Inuit population because the Inuits have a hugely saturated fat diet, but they also have a high omega-3 uh, part of their diet and low omega-6. And he thought I'll add a little bit of fish oil to some of the rats he was experimenting on, and sure enough, they didn't get diabetes. They were not resistant to insulin, and so he followed that up and found out that the higher the omega balance, the less diabetes, the less resistance to insulin these rats had. And in fact, later on, they looked at humans also and found essentially the same thing, that if the omega balance was 20%, in other words, 20% of the polyunsaturates were omega-3, 80% were omega-6, that insulin resistance didn't happen. But if the omega balance was less than 20%,
Mm,
more and more, both the rats and the humans showed insulin resistance or diabetes. So,
fascinating.
yeah.
And I love the fact that in one of his arms of that trial, it was tallow. The tallow arm had a high omega balance and yet did not produce insulin resistance, correct? So it's a very saturated fat rich food, yet
Yeah,
insulin resistance didn't happen, right?
yes, that's true. Actually, one of the differences, and this is what was quite an important aspect of me to discover, was the comparison of American tallow and Australian tallow.
Oh,
Because Australian tallow comes from cattle which are largely grass-fed, whereas American tallow comes from cattle which are largely grain-fed, and especially corn. And corn has essentially no omega-3s in it. And so the tallow from Australian cattle it had enough omega-3 in it to be able to satisfy the needs of the rats, sort of, yeah.
I
And
love that. Oh,
oh, sorry. And in fact, what most people don't realise is the fish higher animals, and they have a requirement for omega-3. And it was discovered back in the 1960s when aquaculture started. It was trout being farmed, and they tried to feed them corn. Well, trout never come across corn normally. And in the fish food that was based on the corn, they found that the fish developed what was called transport shock and various medical problems. And that was the finding back in the 1960s, that actually you need to provide omega-3 to fish because they can't make them. Like us, they have to get them in the diet.
Yeah, and what is what's the mechanism? What's the transport shock? Was it too many omega-6s? Is that deleterious to fish?
Essentially, yeah. The whole series, there was internal things, but they noticed that because the fish were, especially when they wanted to move them, were dying. And that was why it was called transport shock.
Yeah.
So.
And for anyone who doesn't know and is new to the show, I did a dissertation and we published a paper all about that, how the fatty acid profile of beef changes. We used Dr. Hulbert's omega balance because we think I think it's a very far better system. But what we found was dramatic changes in beef, 3 times the amount of omega-3s in beef that is fed on diverse grass-fed pastures. So like he's saying, and poultry and pork. Wow, this changes even more dramatically, I'd say, because they contribute more to the American diet, maybe even Australian diet. Do you want to talk about that too?
Yes, pork is largely fed grain, both actually in Australia and in the US. And of course, chickens and other birds, we feed them grain. And it's very understandable. Grain is so easy to handle, it doesn't go off. And so it's quite an understandable. But what people don't realize is that in general, grains don't have omega-3. In anything you say, there's always an exception. So there are some grains, linseed, also known as flax, does have some omega-3, chia does, but in general, grains lack omega-3. Green leaf is where the omega-3 are coming from. What was I going to? I forgot what I was going to
And
say.
pork. So pork and chicken, large
Pork.
contributors. Yeah.
Yeah, exactly. And it's because of what we feed them. That's the key aspect of things.
Yeah, and I've
Uh,
studied that a lot. Oh, sorry, aspect of things. Finish that.
yeah, that's fine.
Okay, and I was going to say for our paper, we noticed that even grain-fed beef had a lower omega balance, actually a higher omega balance than did pork and chicken. So like if you go to the ratio, it's like chicken can be like a 30-to-1 and pork can be a 30-to-1, and even grain-fed beef was an 8-to-1 if you use the ratio. So what I'm saying is fish and grass-fed beef are the two foods that I rely on most to get my omega-3s. Now, you said something other interesting about the Len Storlein. 20 to 20 or below.
Yeah,
That was interesting. That was the threshold, right?
that seems to be the threshold, which fits in. Actually, there's a society, a scientific society, which called ISFAL, International Society for the Study of Fats and Lipids, and it made suggestions about what humans should take in. It didn't bother making suggestions about saturated fats or monounsaturates because they're not essential. But it suggested that humans needed to take about 4.5 to 5 grams of omega-6 a day and nearly 3 grams of omega-3. And when you work that out, that's an omega balance of about 30%. What it was in the Paleolithic diet, what it was in the early part of the last century in the US. And that's nowadays, there was a study done called What We Eat in America, done in 2021, 2023. And what they found is that the average American was eating nearly 18 grams of omega-6. In other words, about 4 times the amount that was suggested, and was eating 3 grams of omega-3. In other words, the average American diet is massively overweighted in omega-6 and underweighted in omega-3. So the balance is, as I say, about 9 or 10% for the
Wow.
whole. That's the average, and that's part of the problem because it determines what's in membranes. Cell membranes are regulated, and the enzyme that puts the polyunsaturates in can't tell the difference between omega-3 and omega-6. So if you have a diet high in omega-6, in other words, a low omega balance, you'll have cell membranes which are high in omega-6 and low in omega-3. And that's the key problem. Not the storage fat, but the cell membranes. Because membranes are how cells talk to each other. That's where they interact. That's how they interact with the environment. It's how things like insulin act on proteins in the cell membrane. It's such an important part of how a cell functions in the environment.
Yeah, and I want to get down to the mechanisms by which these cell membranes and the imbalance can lead to obesity. But first, people have told me, or I've heard other experts online saying that there's been studies to show that increasing linoleic acid in the diet doesn't increase arachidonic acid in the cell membrane. Do you know which studies they might be referencing? And is it again back down to the balance, or do you have any idea?
Back down to the balance. So yeah, the main omega-3 and omega-6 in the diet are 18 carbons. So that's the main ones you find in plants. In the body, we change them a little bit. We add some carbon. So in the body, the omega-6s are a fatty acid called arachidonic acid, and it's 20 carbons long. And also the main omega-3 is 22 carbons long. So so we convert these 18 carbons to longer chain fatty acids, but no, the membranes just reflect what's in the diet, except for that change in making the fatty acids a bit longer. So, and we did a 12 diet study in rats. We found there was relatively little known about the common situation, the average situation. And these 12 diets provided a huge range of saturated fats, omega-3, omega-6. And what we found is that the arachidonic acid, this long-chain omega-6, was the one that responded most, showed the most variation between the different diet groups. And the best predictor was not the amount of omega-6 that was in the diet, it was the balance. So it's the balance between the two which determines what goes into the membranes.
Yeah, so maybe it is that the background diet is already so high in linoleic acid that adding more is still not doing a lot of change. Do you think could that have been a factor in some research like that?
In our rat study, we controlled these diets very, very strongly.
Yeah.
Part of the problem has been that our approach to medicine is very centered around drugs and capsules and supplements. And so some studies say, oh no, omega-3 doesn't have an effect. And that's because they've given a small supplement to a diet which has got a high omega-6 background. In other words, the key thing in nutrition is the whole of the diet. Everything you eat, put in your mouth, and swallow is your diet. And fish oil supplements can be helpful, but sometimes they have a trivial effect. You can't just ignore everything you eat and take a supplement. It's not like a medicine.
Yes.
It's food. It's not medicine.
Yeah. I love that. Beautifully stated. And we're going to get to the mechanisms. One last question that I just had. So DHA is the 22 carbon omega-3 fatty acid, and I find that that's the one in the membranes. Is that more important than other omega-3 fatty acids, EPA, DPA, or is it, yeah, tell me about that. Why is that one showing up in membranes more?
Well, it seems to be very important. That came out of our animal study. We found 22.6 was very animals that had high metabolic rates and fast activities had lots of 22.6. It's the reason why it's especially high in the brain. We
Yeah.
want our brain to function as fast as possible. We want the cells to communicate with each other quickly. We want the nervous impulse to travel down the neurons very quickly. And so it's super high, and the brain is very tightly regulated. So even vegans who because they only eat plant food, oh, excuse me, I'll have a glass of water. still have lots of 22,6 in their brain. But
Mm.
so it's not just the 22,6 in the diet, which people tend to concentrate on, but of course we convert these plant omega-3s, which are 18 carbons, into the DHA, the 22 carbon omega-3, and it's crucially important, in all sorts of cells, but especially in nervous tissue, especially in the brain.
Awesome. Well, my favorite part of your book, I have to admit, was this chapter on obesity and the three mechanisms by which you believe this imbalance can create obesity. So, can you take us there? What are the three mechanisms, and you can do them in any way you want, any order you want, that make omega balance important to fat gain?
So a low omega balance in the diet means a low omega balance in the membranes. It means a high omega-6, and especially arachidonic acid. So many of these effects, these three effects, relate to the fact that there's a large amount of arachidonic acid, this 20 carbon, 4 double bonds. The reason why that's important is the various cell messengers, important cell messengers of all sorts, are made from this arachidonic acid found in membranes. The first one is that fat cells, their sole job is to store fat and to convert other things like carbohydrate into fat. And they come about, they're called adipocytes in the literature, but they come about very early on. So people that are obese have more fat cells than people that are not obese. In fact, an obese person in one study averages of probably about 75 billion fat cells in the body. A non-obese person has about 45. But the things that turn these stem cells into fat cells are called prostacyclins. They're made from arachidonic acid. I want to try and avoid using too much complicated language, but these messengers come from the omega-6 in the membranes. And when people lose weight, they don't lose fat cells. What happens is the fat cells shrink down. A fat cell says, I want to be fat. I want to accumulate as much fat as possible. So when people, as I say, lose weight, they lose, the fat cells shrink down, but the fat cells are essentially saying to themselves, I want to get fatter. And so what you find is when people go off various things that allow them to lose weight, they just go back to their normal weight. So that's the first thing. The first one is that
Can I ask you one question though?
yeah.
So, would a low omega balanced diet in childhood, what is the relationship? Would that predispose somebody to obesity later too?
Actually, that's one of the most important things. I was very motivated to write my book, and mainly for what we feed children, sort of, and that's been part of the problem. Obese adults generally have been obese from their childhood, and these high omega-6 diets uh, in the child produce more fat cells. The fat cells increase when you get up to the end of teenagehood. Then from then on, the fat cells stay constant. One of the things I think at the moment, there are these anti-obesity drugs which are controlling appetite, the Ozempics, the Wegovy's, the Mounjaros, and sure, people are losing weight by inhibiting their appetite, but generally once they go off these drugs, they'll go back to the obese state. It takes a while, but the fat cells essentially grow back. And you're right. The real problem I see is that what we feed children, and even it's been shown that in pregnancy, the amount of omega-6 in the mother's blood will have an effect on the child's development of fat cells. And so children whose mothers have a lot of omega-6, not much omega-3, their children become obese very early on.
Mm.
That's so it's that message to turn a stem cell into a fat cell, which comes from omega-6, which is a major problem. That's the first mechanism. The second mechanism is, and I'm going to use a complicated word here now, is the endocannabinoids. So when cannabis has been known for a long time, and even in my research for the book, I found out it was 300 AD that people first acknowledged that, probably knew beforehand, that cannabis produces munchies. Cannabis it stimulates appetite. And these, so when they went looking for how cannabis works, they discovered that there were receptors called cannabinoid receptors. And of course, the receptors in our body weren't there for cannabis, they were there for what's called endocannabinoids, endo within our own natural cannabinoids. And they were discovered. And so so one of the aspects that's going on is too much omega-6 in the diet, too much omega-6 in the cell membranes, an increased production of endocannabinoids, and an increase in appetite associated with leading to obesity. There's a lovely study, which I think is good because it involves the food, where they took some humans and they added a sheep cheese to their diet. So these people had to eat 90 grams of a pecorino sheep cheese to their diet, and the sheep were divided into two groups. One group of sheep were fed a normal diet, and another group were given a linseed enriched diet. And linseed, you may remember I mentioned, is high in omega-3. So the omega balance of the cheeses and the normal sheep was 21%. The omega balance of the cheese from the linseed enriched diet was 48%. And from these adults, I think they fed them for a couple of weeks, and there was a crossover design. It was a good study, and these people that had the pecorino cheese from the sheep-fed linseed had or about half the endocannabinoid levels as did the other individuals.
So
So that was just from using a particular food, a sheep cheese. 90 grams is still a lot of cheese, but it's not that much. Sort of, yeah, so that was
So,
interesting.
so what your food ate determined maybe how many cravings you have, or if you get the munchies
Right,
later.
that's
That's
right. Yeah,
crazy. What a testament to it matters not only what you eat, but what you eat eats. There was also a trial I read about in your book where they gave krill powder to people who were obese, which also reduced. So krill powder, high in
that's,
omega-3s, reduced AGA, I think, which endocannabinoid levels, correct?
yeah. There are two major endocannabinoid levels that are made from the membrane fats that have this arachidonic acid in it, the 20 carbon omega-6. So yeah, and a number of studies have shown that. The other thing is that also one of the things that especially fat cells do, but liver does also, is they convert carbohydrates to fat. And they found that when people have a high omega-6 diet, the enzymes that convert the carbohydrates to fat are enhanced. If you have a high omega-3 diet, fish oil or other, actually it doesn't have to be fish oil, green leaf. A lot of green leaf in the diet can decrease the activity of these enzymes. And so things like fatty liver are associated, which is a major problem these days, is largely because of too much omega-6, too much enzymes that convert carbohydrate to fat too active. So there are three things: the development of fat cells stimulated by an omega-6 diet, the appetite, endocannabinoids, munchies in popular parlance, and also the conversion of carbohydrate to fat are all favoured by a low omega-3, high omega-6 diet.
Crazy. And before we get to how we change that omega balance for ourselves and what we should be aiming for, you've done a few self experiments. Can you tell us what you found about your blood glucose levels when you changed your omega balance and what you were eating when you did these experiments?
Yeah, so it was hard trying to convince people. So first of all, I decided I just wanted to see if my cell membranes changed. And so what I did is I decided I'd use the cells on the lining of my cheek. And so for 2 weeks, I had a high omega-6 diet. I will say, to go back to what we mentioned earlier, I no longer buy chicken or pork. I will eat it if I'm presented in a restaurant, or I don't order them in restaurants, but if I'm at somebody's place. So I had chicken and evening meal. All I actually did was change the evening meal. So I went from and so that was a high omega-6 diet, and I looked at my cells, and sure enough, my cells were high in omega-6. And then I changed to 2 weeks on a fish and spinach diet, and the other thing that I had in the high omega-6 diet was I bought those potatoes that you can buy, which are coated in oil. You can go cook them. And I had the same diet. I weighed it out each day. And so I went from a high omega-6 diet to a high omega-3 diet and back to a high omega-6. And my cheek cells changed quite dramatically. Later on, I decided to do the same sort of experiment, high omega-6 for 2 weeks, high omega-3, and then back to the high omega-6. And I also looked at, because I was interested in insulin resistance. So I also looked at my blood glucose levels. So I took a set amount of glucose, and then I looked at the rate at which my blood glucose changed. So what happens is after you have a big meal of glucose, your blood glucose goes up and then it goes down. And the rate at which it goes down is how fast it's going into your tissues or how fast it's being converted. And the rate at which it went down on the high omega-3 section, the middle part of that self-experiment, was twice the rate at which it went down on the high omega-6. So, and I took also samples of the blood for glucose, and I measured the fatty acid changes in the membranes.
Yeah, and that matters because we don't want our blood sugar to remain high for too long. What happens when that happens? Yeah.
Well, it's just not good. You get changes in the proteins in your body, and
It's
etc.
dangerous. Yeah, your body tries to regulate that within a very narrow window. And so the
Yeah.
sooner your body can clear that glucose healthfully, the better. Okay, so let's make this practical. So you were eating potatoes, you were eating things in oil, but what are some simple steps people can take to start getting their omega balance kind of like above 20? What are the biggest needle movers?
Well, one of the biggest, I think, is lots of green leaf material. That's
Yeah.
sort of that's a key aspect. And I avoid deep fried foods nowadays. Because they're fried in oils which are omega-6. It's
Are you on board with like canola and soybean oil because they have higher omega 3s than say corn, safflower, or were you thinking you avoid them mostly entirely?
if I tend to use butter a lot
Yeah.
nowadays because I
Yeah.
know that in Australia is grass fed, and so it's high. If I use a vegetable oil, it will be canola. Canola is an unusual vegetable oil. It's about third. If you look at the polyunsaturates, it's about one-third omega-6, two-thirds. One-third omega-3, two-thirds omega-6.
Mhm.
So I rarely use the other oils. Sometimes you use them for small amounts for a taste aspect, but I avoid fried food, in in vegetable oils as much as possible.
Yeah, and even like fish that come in an oil in a can. Like you want to be careful with that kind of thing too.
Exactly,
Yeah,
because the oil in the canned fish is not fish oil;
right.
it's vegetable oil, and normally the cheap vegetables. So corn oil and safflower oil, So yeah, I always, if I buy tin fish, it's always in salt water, sort of in water.
And how
Yeah.
often are you eating fish? And how many servings of leafy greens are you getting every day? And are you also eating other green vegetables?
It's mainly leafy greens and fish regularly. I eat quite a lot of lamb if I eat meat in Australia, and in the US, because lamb isn't grain fed. It's not except in some unusual circumstances. Yeah, so my diet, the meats are largely lamb, pasture fed. Beef, I'll eat, but I avoid pork, and also I avoid chicken, uh, sort of these days.
Yeah, and you mentioned Vital Farms. There was a thing over in America where they found out one of these egg companies was feeding their chickens corn and soy. And so it had linoleic acid percentages that were kind of equivalent to canola oil. And so is the amount in eggs something that you would be worried about?
Um, yeah, well, I try and choose an egg which has as much omega-3 in it as possible. So yeah,
Yeah.
um, yeah, you can't be too obsessive about these things sometimes, but just try and play the odds all the time. So
Yeah.
yeah,
That's what I
and
was thinking. If it's a regular thing, like if it's a staple, yeah, I think be mindful about it. But like you said, you can't control every single thing every
yeah.
time. Yeah. Now, how long does it take for these changes to become apparent in your body? Like, how long does it take for the fatty acids to turn over in our storage form and in our cell membranes?
Well, the cell membranes are change quite rapidly, except in some tissues. The brain is very protected, and so it takes quite a while for the brain to change, and it's tightly regulated. And omega threes, and especially some of the long chain ones, are very high in it. Um, it takes a while, and it takes a sustained effort, to be able to change your body. There's so much fat in your body, and of course, the more um, fat cells you have, the more adipose tissue, the longer it will take. I became aware of only recently is ultra processed foods, and there's so a Paleolithic diet was about 40% omega 3, 60% omega 6. The Inuit diet, which is about 50% omega 3 and 6. The US diet and the Australian diet are about 10% now, and that's quite low. Ultra processed foods have a balance of about 1% omega 3 and 99% omega 6. And
Wow.
that's been part of the problem. The ultra processed foods, people aren't paying attention to the balance between the omega 3s and the omega 6s.
Yeah.
Um, and that's one of the major problems, I think, in the modern diet. So there was a study done by a guy called Kevin Hall in 2019, the NIH in the US, where they took people, two groups of people, for 2 weeks. They fed them an ultra processed uh, food diet, and for 2 weeks they fed them an unprocessed, and they swapped over halfway. And it was matched for calories, sugar, protein, fat, total amount of fat, fiber, macronutrients, but the fatty acid composition varied. And
Mm.
the omega balance of the ultra processed food was 7%, whereas the omega balance of the was 7% omega 3, and what's 93% omega 6, whereas the other diet, the unprocessed food diet, was more like 16% omega 3 and 84% omega 6. And what they found is the individual gained weights on the ultra processed food diets and lost weight on the unprocessed. There was little difference in their energy expenditure, but significant amount of difference in their food intake. So
Mm.
the omega-6 foods are driving appetite also, and people are overeating.
Well, thank you. This has been so amazing. And if you guys Moral of the story is if you have more omega-6s and you don't have enough omega-3s, you're probably going to want to eat more. You're going to make more fat cells, and you might
Yep.
even convert more carbohydrates to fat. So you'll be fighting an uphill battle to get to where maybe that natural set point where your body wants to live. Your book is incredible. I highly recommend it. We're going to do more parts in this series. We're going to talk about pain. We're going to talk about mental health. There are so many important applications of this balance. I really want to help you understand. But like I
Yeah.
said, it was book of the year. It is worth a read. I've read it 3 times. I'm going through it my third time. I learn things every time, and it re-inspires me to really pay attention to this aspect of my diet. And I think I feel better. I have less pain in my body for sure. And I noticed that my weight is it's more stable when I'm having more omega-3s in my diet. So thank you for your work, Dr. Hulbert. I look forward to the next time, and I just appreciate all that you're doing.
Thank you.